She didn't think that he was serious, at least she hoped he wasn't. But when she heard the light footsteps coming from above her, she knew it could only be one thing. Sure, spending nights with him was relatively normal, with them as Ladybug and Cat Noir anyway, but the idea of him coming to her home specifically to see her and not to patrol was a whole other matter. Marinette's cheeks burned furiously as she thought about the blonde that was currently on her roof. She pressed her palms against her face and squished her cheeks together as if the pressure would take the redness and heat away. She needed to gather her wits before going to see him. Slapping her cheeks and straightening her posture, she strode across the room and huffed before climbing up the ladder to her loft. Marinette opened the hatch to the roof and peeked out, unnoticed by Cat. She raised an eyebrow, eyes rolling back and forth as they trailed the pacing figure. His black leather-like suit blended in perfectly with the night sky, but the moonlight bounced off of his golden hair, giving it a soft, ethereal glow. She silently mused that perhaps he hadn't thought that far ahead into their midnight rendezvous as he looked a little distraught. "You're going to wear a hole in my roof if you keep that up." Cat Noir literally jumped up, startled by her voice, and landed on the railing of the roof, eliciting a laugh from the girl. She hoisted herself up onto the roof and Cat gave her the once-over, taking in the sight of her pink tulip hem shorts and loose off-shoulder tee. The delicate curve of her neck to her shoulder was enough to send his mind reeling, and he wondered how he was going to survive the rest of the night if something as simple as a shoulder was making him go crazy. "Good evening, Marinette," he grinned, shoving his inner turmoil into the deep recesses of his mind. She cocked her head slightly to the side, and her hair swept gently across her bare shoulder. He gulped. "It's just a shoulder. She was barely clothed earlier that day at the pool. He could do this." Marinette snorted slightly, giving him an amused smirk. "Evening? It's almost midnight," she pointed out. "You should be sleeping. Don't you have a busy schedule, Mr. Model?" she teased. This was good. Her nerves were calm. Even though it had been a while since Marinette had her suspicions about his identity, she always found it easy to talk normally to Cat. Perhaps it was his mask that kept her from making a fool of herself. She did remember once telling Tiki that it'd be easier to talk to him without seeing his face. "I do, but I'm sure I can squeeze you in." He began approaching her with an almost predatory look in his eyes, and it made her heart race. "After all, you are my top priority, princess," he purred and brought her hand to his lips. Okay, she took it back. Maybe talking to Cat wasn't going to be as easy as she thought. An amused grin stretched across his face, and she couldn't help but feel irritated knowing that he was purposely teasing her. Two can play at that game. "Would you like to come in?" she asked innocently, and he just blinked at her. He wasn't expecting the invitation, thinking they were just going to spend some time together on the rooftop. She stood on her tippy toes and leaned in, whispering in his ear, "It's hardly private out here." Her quiet voice had a husky note to it, and he felt his knees weaken slightly. He wasn't sure if he should accept or not. Sure, it was his idea to come here in the dead of the night, but he wasn't sure about being in her bedroom in the dead of the night, alone. Seeing that he wasn't responding, Marinette thought that maybe she took it too far. "Come on, there are some leftover vanilla eclairs. They won't be good anymore tomorrow, so let's have a late-night snack," she smiled. Cat's eyes lit up at the mention of the pastries, and Marinette couldn't help but laugh. "Pastries, my favorite! See, you like fashion and my dad's a fashion designer. I like pastries and your dad is a baker. We're clearly perfect for each other." Clearly he had gathered himself and was able to start his ridiculous flirting again. Marinette just chuckled and shook her head before turning to go back down the hatch. Cat followed behind, waiting for her to get off the bed before he came down. Once he was in, he looked around the area and then back up. "Now I see where you get your killer arms from," he said mirthfully, taking note that there was no ladder for her to get out of the hatch. That meant that she had to pull herself up to get up there. Marinette just rolled her eyes at his Cheshire-like grin. "Wait here, I'll be back." Cat watched her descend from the loft and then disappear through the hatch on the floor, most likely getting the eclairs she was talking about. He also decided to climb down from the loft, feeling it was inappropriate for him to be in her bed. He was standing in Ladybug's room. Ladybug was always a mystery to him, preferring to keep her identity a secret. But now he was here, in the middle of her room, where she spent at least a third of her time. Yes, sleeping counted, and where all her personal touches adorned the room. He had never felt so close to his lady. He heard Marinette come back up, and she closed the hatch quietly as to not wake her parents. His throat felt parched, realizing again that they were alone in her room, but this time without her parents' knowledge. "Why don't you have a seat?" She gestured over to her chase. The two made themselves comfortable on the chase with the tray of eclairs and tea in between them. Cat was thankful that she also brought something to drink because he kept finding himself feeling thirsty. He had to keep calm. So far, so good. Tiki, I brought you a snack, Marinette held up an eclair, and Kat saw a red blur float down from her loft. He blinked at the creature that happily grabbed the eclair, and then floated in front of him. Hi, she said giddily with a cute high-pitched giggle. You're... Tiki, Marinette's Kwame. It's nice to meet you. She gave him a big smile, and he returned it. He was a little surprised, not expecting the Kwame to be friendly. Tiki was so different from Plag. She was nice and bubbly, and he was a little jealous. Not to say that he didn't like Plag, but he wished the little black cat had a little more enthusiasm. Is Plag doing well? She asked, her blue eyes growing wide in curiosity. You know Plag? Kat asked. He never thought about it before, but that would make sense. Of course I do. Our Chosens have only been partners for eons. She rolled her eyes with another giggle, and suddenly he felt silly for asking. I'll let you ask him for yourself then. You must miss each other. Ketnor grinned and released his transformation. He heard a small yelp beside him as Marinette tumbled off the chase, completely surprised. It was the first time seeing it before her very own eyes, Ketnor turning back to Adrian. It somehow solidified the fact even more that they were the same. She was pulled out of her shock when she heard an unfamiliar voice. Tiki! Marinette looked over to see a small cat-shaped Kwame flying towards her own, and she couldn't help but smile. Plag! The two Kwames embraced each other, and Adrian was flabbergasted by Plag's un-Plag-like behavior. He never pegged the black Kwame as one to give hugs. Well, Tiki turned her attention back to the teens, Plag and I have lots to catch up on, so we'll leave you kids be. She giggled and grabbed Plag before zooming back up onto the loft. Adrian heard a soft giggle and turned to see Marinette pulling herself up from the floor and returning to her spot on the chase. They must have missed each other, Marinette smiled, gazing up towards her bed. She sometimes wondered if Tiki ever got lonely. She was always forced to stay in her purse, and her only talking companion had been Marinette, so it was nice to see her so ecstatic over seeing an old friend. Yeah, I've never seen Plag show a shred of affection for anything aside from cheese, so this is new. A hint of annoyance crossed his features as he thought about how Plag's favorite cheese just had to be camembert. Marinette made a mental note of what Plag liked so she could treat him too the next time he was over. She blushed at the thought. If there was a next time anyway. She thought it was perfectly in her capabilities to royally screw something up and make Adrian withdraw his statement about loving her. Her cheeks grew warm as she remembered his words. The two began small chatter as they enjoyed their eclairs, just simple conversations about school and the like. Anything to take away from the awkwardness of the situation. It was amazing how much having their masks allowed them to be confident and speak so freely, but with them gone, it was nerve-wracking. Alia's been telling me that she's close to figuring out who Ladybug really is, Marinette chuckled as she thought about her friend. She actually found it surprising that the blogger hadn't already figured it out. Actually, the day after she was akumatized, she came over and showed me a picture of you with Ketnor's costume drawn on and suggested that you look like him. If only she'd do the same for me, though I don't think I'd want to deal with the consequences of her knowing. Is that when you started thinking I was Ketnor? Adrian licked some vanilla ganache off of his finger and went for another eclair. Nope, I was pretty convinced that you two weren't the same, she remarked. He raised an eyebrow as he looked at her. She still wasn't looking his way as she talked. Even though the light in the room was dim, he could see her pink-tinged cheeks. He couldn't blame her. It was pretty forward of him to invite himself over like this. So, what let the cat out of the bag? Adrian asked. Marinette laughed at his attempt to add cats into the conversation. She then raised a finger to her chin and hummed, thinking about the answer to his question. It wasn't as if she just woke up one day and thought that Ketnor must be Adrian. I guess I started having suspicions when you came over to help me with my uncle? She let out a sheepish laugh. The bow was strange, but I didn't dwell on it too much since I was still freaking out about talking to my uncle. But after that, I guess I just subconsciously started picking up on the cat-like things you do. The winking, the grins, and... Marinette felt her cheeks burn and shook her head. She shifted her eyes and glanced shyly over to his expectant face. She blinked as she noticed some cream at the corner of his lips. She raised a finger and ran it against his lips, wiping the cream off. He was visibly startled from the contact, and she couldn't help but laugh. His cheeks were flushed, and she appreciated that their roles were reversed for once. You got cream on your lip. She held her finger up to show the small dollop of cream she wiped off. She turned away from him again, facing forward and absent-mindedly sticking the finger in her mouth. He gulped, Adam's apple bobbing as he watched her lick the cream off her finger. There was something erotic about her tongue gliding along her fingertip that made his insides twist into knots. You got some too. He heard his voice, but it didn't register in his mind that he actually spoke. His mind was too occupied with the sight of the girl sitting next to him. She turned her gaze back to him. Cream, he simply stated and leaned in closer. Marinette sat there rigidly, paralyzed by his approaching figure. Adrian? She started, but a sharp intake of breath took over as she felt his tongue sweep across the corner of her lips. Her heart was pounding and heat rushed to her head, making her dizzy. She swayed slightly, and he placed a hand on her arm to steady her. Adrian pulled away just far enough that their foreheads were barely touching. He closed his eyes and sighed. He could feel her warm breath blow against his skin, the sweet scent of vanilla overtaking him. "Can I kiss you?" If she hadn't been in a daze, she would have teased him for asking, especially after he'd just licked her. But he was so close, and it made her forget everything else. He felt her bangs brush against him as she nodded lightly. Without a second thought, he captured her lips with his, relishing in their softness. She tasted even better than the vanilla eclairs that they just had, and he found himself becoming intoxicated by her. His hand fumbled around for the tray and pushed it to the other side of the chase. Once the obstacle was out of the way, he slid his hands around her waist and pulled her closer. When Marinette realized she was nearly on top of him, she broke away from the kiss. She could hear a whimper of protest come from him. Her blue eyes gazed over his features, and she was surprised to see such a foreign expression on his face. His eyes gleamed hungrily in the dim light, and his lips were raw from their kisses. It was a mesmerizing sight. She leaned back down and kissed him again, straddling him as he leaned back against the back of the chase. Her hands roamed along his chest, and she could feel his racing heart that matched her own. In the back of his mind, he wondered what would happen if her parents knew that their sweet innocent daughter was currently making out with an equally innocent boy in her room in the middle of the night. He knew that her parents thought well of him, and he hoped that that impression would remain. It was selfish, he knew, to hope that he remained in their good graces while he snuck into their home to make out with their precious daughter. "Adrian," her voice came out breathlessly against his lips. He hummed in acknowledgement but still sought for her lips. "We should stop," she said. Adrian sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Stopping was the last thing he wanted to do, but what he wanted didn't matter. Marinette's words were his command. She felt her heart pang at his reaction. It's getting late, and I didn't want to." She wrenched her hands nervously, hoping that he didn't take it the wrong way. "I know." He gave her a gentle smile to reassure her that he understood. It was good that she wanted to stop, because he knew that if they went any further, he might not have the willpower to stop. She shifted on his lap to get up, and he inhaled sharply as his eyes closed and his head fell back into the cushion. There was an unmistakable blush on his face, and she paused when she felt something against her thigh. Realization hit her, and she blushed wildly. He blurted out an apology in embarrassment. No, sorry, I didn't mean to." She nervously stumbled on her words and quickly got off of him. He sat up and dropped his searing face into his palm. Then there was a giggle. He looked up to see her still with rosy cheeks, trying hard to suppress her laughter. He couldn't help but join in. They were an awkward mess. When their laughter died down, they gazed at each other shyly. "You laughed," she said, a serene smile on her face. He blinked. "You're always smiling or grinning, but I've never heard you laugh aside from the first time we met," she clarified. She always wondered about it. She loved his laughter, but as she watched him throughout the year, she had never heard the sound again. Even Cat Noir, being as silly as he was, never came close to laughing. It really gave her insight on who he really was, and it saddened her that he felt too reserved to let his voice out. He never realized it. There were many instances he recalled where he was close to laughing, but he supposed he never did laugh out loud. His cheeks warmed up as he thought of how she noticed his lack of laughter. It made him feel fuzzy inside that she cared enough to notice something like that. "You should do it more often," she spoke again, pulling him from his thoughts. "I like your laugh." He blushed and nodded. She twiddled her fingers awkwardly, and he smiled at her cuteness. "It's nearly 1 a.m. I should probably get going," Adrian offered, figuring he'd already made her uncomfortable enough. But when he saw the look of disappointment momentarily flicker through her eyes, he wanted to take it back. Before he could say anything else, she nodded and smiled. "You're right, you need your beauty sleep," she grinned. "I'm always beautiful," he said dramatically, making her laugh. She agreed with him and held her hand out to help him up. They proceeded to head back up towards the roof, and Adrian apologized to Tiki for taking Plag away so soon. Plag pouted, but Tiki just smiled, saying there was always next time. They climbed out onto the roof and walked ahead, towards the railing. He reluctantly turned around to bid her a farewell, but she spoke first. "I guess I'll see you Monday," Marinette smiled shyly. It'd be the first time they'd be in school, knowing each other's identities for sure. There was an unreadable expression on his face, and she watched him curiously as he began to walk back towards her. She was surprised when he wrapped his arms around her and buried his face in the crook of her neck. He sighed, breath tickling her. She smelled like vanilla too. He was just so comforted by her presence, and the idea of going home felt so wrong. Even though his room contained everything that a rambunctious boy could ever dream of, it just didn't feel like home to him. It didn't have the warmth and coziness that Marinette's home had. Adrian? I don't want to wait until Monday, he breathed. Marinette wasn't sure if it was the cool breeze that blew by or Adrian's breath that gave her goosebumps. She trembled slightly and he held her closer. Plag would probably yell at him later for crushing him, but he didn't care at the moment. He let his lips trail along her neck and her quiet whimper urged him to continue. Her face seared as he continued his ministrations, now slinking down to her collarbone. Adrian! She jerked away and took a few steps back, scolding him. He looked surprised for a second before a cat-like grin made its way onto his face. He eyed the reddened mark that he left on her collarbone with a sense of satisfaction. You'd better hope I can cover this up with makeup, she frowned, blush still on her face. Or else? He teased, eyes gleaming like a cat's, even though he wasn't transformed. Adrian expected her to get angry and pout cutely, but she did no such thing. He blinked as she just stared at him. Somewhere in his mind, he was telling himself to just apologize and admit defeat. She was definitely planning something, and he was going to be sorry. He was right, she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking that he won. Marinette smirked and sauntered over to him, her swaying hips drawing his eyes down towards them. Before he knew it, she had reached him and snaked her arms around his neck. The way she looked at him through her lidded eyes, with a smirk playing across her lips, made him nervous. She leaned up towards his ear, much like she did earlier. Bad kitties need to be punished, she purred in his ears before trailing kisses along his jaw. He clenched his eyes shut, heat traveling up to his face when her lips latched onto his neck. He felt a pleasurable tickle from her lips, but before he could enjoy himself anymore, she pulled away and stepped back. She sent him a sly smile. Good luck explaining that during your photo shoot, her eyes lowered deviously. Good night, kitty cat, she smiled and turned around to go back to her room, leaving a dumbfounded Adrian standing on her rooftop. What just happened? Adrian let out a breath he didn't even know he was holding, but all he got in reply was Plag's cackling. That wasn't nice, my lady. Ladybug whirled around, surprised to see Cat Noir standing behind her. It was her turn to patrol that night, so she hadn't expected to see him. But judging from his words, she knew exactly why he was there. An amused smile ghosted over her lips, and she turned away, throwing her yo-yo to swing to the top of the Eiffel Tower for one last look over Paris before heading home. She knew Cat would follow. He landed nimbly next to her and stood up, facing her. She, however, kept her eyes over Paris. Seriously, Natalie started firing questions at me first thing in the morning, and I had no clue what was going on. Cat Noir frowned and raised a hand to his neck. He was thankful that it was too dark for her to see the blush on his face. Ladybug's laugh rang out through the night sky, and it made him frown even more. It's great that you find this so funny. I had to lie to her and my father that it was from a bug bite. Well, that wouldn't be far from the truth, would it? She turned to him, eyes crinkled in amusement. Her words made him blush even harder. He quickly turned away, trying his hardest to look angry. I'm pretty sure Father didn't believe me, Cat sighed. Maybe you should have thought about that before marking me, She chuckled. It was so hot today that no amount of makeup wanted to stay on. I had to wear a scarf. A scarf? In this weather? You're into fashion, no one would think it's weird, he argued. Ladybug snorted. Are you kidding me? My mom figured me out right away. I'm not exactly the best at lying. You're lucky she likes you. Cat's ears twitched as he perked up from the news. He turned back to her, eyes wide, a big grin making its way onto his face. His tail swished around wildly, and she regretted telling him that tidbit of information. You didn't tell her what really happened, did you? He was curious about how the conversation went down. He doubted that she revealed his identity and mentioned that he snuck in. He was sure Sabine wouldn't be happy about that. Of course not. I told her it happened during the trip and she just didn't notice because my hair was down, she explained. She didn't want to recall how her mom had gushed about it. Normal parents weren't supposed to be happy when their child came home with a hickey. Ladybug groaned. She even went on about how adorable her grandkids were gonna be. What? Cat's voice pulled her out of her thoughts and she looked at him to see that his eyes were extra wide in shock. What? She repeated and blinked. Oh. Ladybug's face grew so red that even Cat could tell because she had pretty much matched her costume. She had said that last part out loud. Oh God, I didn't. That wasn't, you weren't, Ladybug sputtered, still blushing furiously. Cat had a blush of his own. He sat down, letting a leg dangle over the side, and looked back out over the city, letting the breeze cool his burning cheeks. "I wish we were older," he suddenly said, drawing her out of her embarrassment. She looked down at him, and if she looked hard enough, she could see the pink cheeks peeking out from under his mask. He looked serious, unusual for his Cat Noir persona. "Why?" She stooped down to his level and peered at him. "So that I could ask you to marry me." He had said it so calmly and seriously that she couldn't even go through her usual stages of freaking out. She only stared at him with rosy cheeks and lips parted in surprise. "That way, I wouldn't have to worry about having to sneak around to see you. I wouldn't have to worry about going to the same school as you and being in the same class. I'd be able to see you first thing every morning and last thing every night." His words were so sweet, and she felt a fuzzy feeling in her chest. And when he turned to face her, eyes full of love, her chest tightened and she knew that she was completely and utterly in love with him. "You can still ask me, you know," she said nervously, averting her eyes from his piercing gaze. She heard him chuckle and her heart skipped a beat. She would never tire of hearing his laugh. "Surely you deserve a better proposal than one where we're on the job." If he had to be honest, that wasn't the only reason why he didn't just pop the question. He had been clear about his feelings for her, but it wasn't the same the other way around. He knew that she cared for him, and her actions had shown that maybe there was something more, but she hadn't explicitly told him how she felt about him, so he wasn't exactly keen about the possibility of rejection. "I don't need anything special," she said quietly and scooted closer to him, sitting down on the beam and letting her legs dangle. "I'm happy just being by your side." She leaned her head slightly against his arm, and he looked down at her head curiously. "You are?" he asked in astonishment. "I am," she nodded, a smile gracing her lips at his bewilderment. "Why?" It sounded like he was trying to be silly, but she knew that it was a serious question. She knew that he had his insecurities. Even though he sometimes joked about how great he was, she picked up on all the times that he put himself down, and it was something he did more often than she would have liked. "Because you're my partner, my friend," she said, voice trailing off. Cat Noir's sigh dispersed into the night air, and he returned his eyes to the scenery. He wondered if he was deluding himself. Neither Ladybug nor Marinette had really showed any interest in him, aside from their makeout session from the night before. That was hardly enough to say she had romantic feelings for him. What was he expecting her to say? "I love you." He stilled, not quite sure if the words were actually spoken or if he was imagining it. His wide eyes rested on her again to see her biting her lip with a blush across her cheeks. She looked up at him with her bright eyes, stars dancing in them, and it took his breath away. It was then that he knew that they were her words. He raised a clawed hand to her face, tilting her chin upwards before leaning down and pressing a kiss against her lips. The only thing that passed through his mind was how much he loved the girl before him. Even at the age of 15, he knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. Other people would probably look at him and shake their heads, saying things along the lines of, "You're only 15, what do you know about love?" But to him, there was nothing truer than what he felt for her. He was irrevocably in love, and nothing was ever going to change that. She pulled away, giving him a coy smile. "We should both head home. You shouldn't even be here." She tapped his nose with a finger and laughed before standing up. "Monday?" She tilted her head amusedly, expecting him to whine about not wanting to wait again. But he only grinned in return. "Of course, my lady." Of course he had lied. Well, lying would be an overstatement. He simply agreed with her when she said Monday. He never said that he wasn't going to see her Sunday. So she just shook her head when he landed on her rooftop after his patrol. "Cat," she said warningly as she climbed out of the hatch and looked at him with displeasure. The both of them were going to be dead tired if these late-night liaisons continued. He ignored her frown and approached her, helping her up. She couldn't stay upset with him when he looked so absolutely giddy. "You're in a good mood," she remarked, and his smile grew bigger. "Of course I am, because I get to see you, Marinette. I thought you'd be sleeping." "You thought I'd be sleeping, but you came by anyway?" She raised an eyebrow, and he chuckled sheepishly in apology. "So what is it this time?" She folded her arms and peered at him. Still with a joyful look on his face, he released his transformation, taking her by surprise. She was never going to get used to that. She blushed when Adrian's form appeared before her, wearing a pressed button shirt that was tucked into his black slacks. A pair of black leather dress shoes covered his feet, and a tie and blazer topped his ensemble. She wondered why he was dressed so sharply. Flag floated towards her hatch and phased through the glass door, leaving the kids alone. He'd much rather hang with Tiki, but he mused that Tiki would probably want to watch what was about to go down. Marinette shifted her weight onto one leg and placed a hand on her hip, letting the other dangle by her side. She felt severely self-conscious, dressed in shorts and a tee when he looked so dashing, but she couldn't be blamed. "Way to make me feel underdressed for bed," she muttered. Without any words, Adrian knelt down and took her hand into his and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. She felt lightheaded, not used to such attention as Marinette, and most definitely not when the offending party was Adrian and not Katnor. He released her hand and reached inside his jacket, pulling out a small red velvet box. She felt her breath hitch in her throat, not daring to think about what was inside. But he'd already opened it, and she stared at the small ring that sparkled under the moonlight. "Marinette, will you marry me?" His voice was soft, and she swore that his eyes were the brightest she'd ever seen them. They were filled with such a genuine loving innocence that she thought her heart was going to explode. She raised her hands up to cover her heated cheeks and internally squealed. He had actually gone out and bought her a ring to propose to her, even after she said she didn't need anything special. "Oh, you silly cat!" She peeked out from her hands before swooping down and pulling him in for a kiss. When she pulled away, he breathlessly chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes?" He grinned cheekily, and she could only nod with a simper. He removed the ring from its protective box and slid it onto her finger. She took the time to admire the ring. It fit her perfectly. It wasn't anything too extravagant, but she thought it was breathtakingly beautiful. It was a platinum band with a small princess-cut diamond in the center, rightfully so for his princess, and 2 pink sapphires adorning the sides. It still must have cost quite a bit, and she bit her lip worriedly. "Oh, Adrian, you didn't have to. This must have cost so much." She didn't want him spending his hard-earned money on her. It was clearly more than what a regular 15-year-old could afford. "Not at all. I'm sorry this was all I could get. I wanted to get something nicer, but Father would probably raise hell on earth if he found a questionable sum of money being drained from my account," he laughed. She briefly wondered what amount would not be questionable. "You're crazy. It's beautiful." She put her hand closer to her body and held it with the other protectively. "This is more than enough. I won't accept anything else," she said to him with wide eyes, as if he were going to take it away. "If you think that I'm not going to shower you with gifts, then you're completely mistaken," he chuckled when she pouted. He was sure his dad would be fond of her. Well, as fond as Gabriel Agreste could be. She was a fabulous designer, and she wasn't a gold digger. Adrian watched her contentedly as she admired the ring. Then a moment of stark realization hit her, and she stared at the ring with wide eyes. "How am I going to explain this? Mom is going to flip out, and Alia..." Alia... She brought her hands up to her head and grabbed her hair in terror. Alia was going to totally flip. For the weekend, Adrian and Marinette were just friends that barely hung out together. How would she go about explaining that within the span of 2 days he had proposed and she said yes? His laughter drew her out of her panic. "You don't have to wear it," he said, casting her a gentle smile. He didn't mean to do anything to put her in an awkward position with everyone. He just wanted to propose, and there was no way he was doing it empty-handed. She looked at him as if he'd grown 2 heads, and her mouth fell in the most adorable-looking frown. "But I want to," she whined. Oh, how he just wanted to wrap her up into his arms and never let go. She stood up and held her hands out to him. He took them and pulled himself up. She was about to ask him to come in when a red blur shot out and latched onto her cheek happily. "Oh, Marinette!" Tiki laughed as she snuggled against the girl's cheek. "I can't believe it. You two are so adorable," she gushed. Marinette looked at Adrian's smiling face with Plag by his side. "Come in?" she asked. "As much as I'd love to." He squeezed her hands. "It's late, and I don't want to keep you from getting your rest." He raised her hands and pressed a kiss to both of them. "I'll see you tomorrow." She nodded. "Tomorrow." Getting by her mother was easier than expected. She grabbed a croissant to go and rushed out of the door towards the school. She looked at the ring, shining under the sun as she ran, and her heart fluttered. She wondered how far in the day she'd get before Alia noticed it. The answer was, not far. Not far at all. Alia's eyes zeroed in on the ring almost immediately after seeing the designer. She looked back up to Marinette's flushed face and gripped her shoulders tightly. What is that? She looked absolutely terrifying, Marinette thought. The girl's eyes were wide and demanding, and her lips were twisted into a scowl. She didn't expect Alia to see it so quickly and still didn't have a story planned out yet. She was suddenly extra glad that the love bite on her collarbone had lightened enough to be easily covered with makeup. Nothing but squeaks and mumbles escaped her lips as she shrunk away from Alia's prying gaze. Out of the corner of her eyes, she saw Nino and Adrian walking towards the school steps. Great, she thought. The one person she didn't want to appear in front of her at the moment. Adrian's eyes met hers, and she thought her face would burst into flames. Alia noticed that Marinette's eyes went astray and turned around to see the two boys. There was a distinct blush on Adrian's face. Alia's jaw dropped, and she turned back to Marinette, shaking her vigorously. Marinette, you answer me right now. Did you get this ring from Adrian Agreste? Marinette could feel the sweat seeping out of her pores from Alia's intense gaze. Her mouth flapped open a few times, but nothing came out. Marinette! Marinette winced. Yes? Alia released her and held her head in her hands. She began pacing around in circles, eyes wide in disbelief. Marinette straightened her clothes and looked at her friend, who was clearly having a mini meltdown. She could hear her saying, "Oh my god," over and over again. Marinette wasn't sure how to take Alia's reaction. Said girl finally stopped her pacing and turned towards Marinette. "What are you not telling me?" She narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing the shorter girl. "What are you talking about?" "Don't what are you talking about me? You guys were barely talking on Friday, and now you have a ring on your wedding finger. Oh my god, don't tell me you guys have been secretly dating this whole time, and that you're pregnant." "What? No!" Marinette blushed. The gears in her mind spun quickly, trying to formulate a story that would satisfy the blogger. "I was out shopping yesterday, and the ring was on display at the jewelry store. I was admiring it when I bumped into him. He noticed me ogling at it, so he got it for me as a thanks for the fun time he had on Friday." She was impressed with herself. Yes, the story was lame, but she had at least said it in a believable manner. Alia raised an eyebrow, and she pulled Marinette's hand up, studying the ring. "That does not look like a ring that you just get someone. Looks like it cost at least 1,000, Alia frowned. Marinette felt lightheaded at the amount that Alia just uttered. She sure hoped he didn't spend that much. She would have been happy with just a cheap toy ring. Unless, she eyed the fashion designer, that fun time he was talking about wasn't about the pool. Alia waggled her brows at Marinette suggestively. She had just about combusted right then and there. "Alia, I told you nothing like that happened," Marinette blushed furiously. "I don't know, Marinette. 1,000 euros for a pretty girl's virginity doesn't seem too steep." "Alia!" Marinette's jaw dropped. She couldn't believe the vulgarity coming out of her best friend's mouth. Ugh. She covered her face in utmost embarrassment. Alia came to her side and swung her arm around her shoulders and began walking her into the school. "Well, that's what I'm going to think until you tell me what really happened." Alia smirked, and she only got muffled replies in return as Marinette still had her face buried in her hands. When they entered the classroom, she avoided Adrian's gaze, and Nina only raised a curious eyebrow at her flushed face. Alia sat down in her seat and leaned forward, folding her arms on top of the desk. She greeted the two boys in front of her, and they turned around to return the gesture. Her eyes then landed on Adrian, and a puckish grin formed on her lips. For some reason, he felt oddly wary of her. His eyes momentarily shifted over to Marinette when he heard her groan. She had her head down on the desk, hiding her face from view. "So, Adrian," Alia made sure to speak low enough so their other classmates couldn't hear. "I saw the gift you got, Marinette. Very nice. Must have cost quite a bit." "What gift?" Nino blinked, completely out of the loop. Alia ignored him and continued to peer at the blonde boy. His eyes shifted over to Marinette again to see that she had tilted her head up, staring at him with desperate wide eyes. He had absolutely no clue what Marinette told Alia and didn't know what to say to proceed. He'd just have to wing it. Not really. It was part of my dad's collection, so I was able to get my hands on it pretty easily," he said cautiously, eyes still flitting over to Marinette for any sign of validation. She seemed content with his answer until Alia's amused humming sent her into a panic again. "Still a bit much for a thank you gift, though," Alia remarked. Nino piped up again about said gift, but was ignored again, much to his irritation. Before Alia could continue, Marinette groaned. "Kill me. Just kill me now," she muttered before sitting up, propping her elbows on the desk and pressing her palms against her eyes. "Whoa, sweet ring, Marinette." Nino blinked at the piece of jewelry and turned to Adrian. "Did you get her that?" He had spoken a little too loudly as the rest of the class turned towards them. In a sudden, overpowering terror, Marinette stood up quickly, still feeling everyone's eyes on her. She rushed out of her seat, and on the way down, she pulled Adrian along with her, the two disappearing out of the classroom doors. The class was left confused, and only Alia had an amused smile on her face. Perhaps she took it too far. Nino shot her a baffled look, so she began texting him about what the whole scene was about. Marinette panted, bent over and hands resting on her knees as Adrian stood by her, slightly worried and infinitely confused. She had dragged him to an empty corner of the school in hopes of avoiding prying eyes. "Sorry about that," she breathed and tried to calm her racing heart. She straightened up to meet his worried gaze, and a blush stretched across her cheeks. "I told her that you bought me the ring as a thank you for the fun time on Friday, since, I dragged you out to the pool and everything." She misconstrued the meaning of fun time. Her voice trailed off in sheer humiliation. "Alia, she she started, but her voice caught in her throat at the thought of the rest of the statement. She took another deep breath. She thinks that we did something. Did it? Oh, how she thought her face was going to melt off. On the bus on Friday, and that you bought me the ring in compensation. Did what? He blinked at her before pausing. It took him a few moments longer before his own face grew warm. He brought a hand up to cover his burning cheeks. I'm so sorry. She made you uncomfortable. Marinette frowned as she pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. Adrian watched her face go from angry to surprised to embarrassed and back to angry as she texted who he only assumed was Alia. That's a pretty bold assumption on her part. He rubbed the back of his neck nervously, finally responding to the bombshell that she just dropped. Surely Alia thought better of him. He didn't seem like the kind of guy who would have sex with a girl and then buy his way out of guilt, did he? Isn't it? Sure, I may have had the biggest crush on you, but I wouldn't have done something so irresponsible, she ranted, barely looking up from her phone. But when she realized what she just said, she stopped her typing and slowly looked up from her phone to Adrian's face. She caught a glimpse of surprise before a wide grin spread across his face. We should get back to class, she squeaked and zoomed off. When she returned to the classroom, all eyes were on her. It was nerve-wracking, but at least Chloe was still absent. She didn't want to have to deal with the obnoxious blonde, especially when Adrian was involved. She was certain that if the mayor's daughter had been there earlier, all hell would have broken loose. Ugh, move it, will you? Marinette felt a hard shove against her back, and she yelped as she flew forward to the ground. She spoke, or rather thought, too soon. She should have known that her luck wasn't that great. Chloe humphed as she walked by, and Sabrina followed behind. Chloe, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop picking on my girlfriend. Marinette blinked as a hand appeared in front of her, offering her assistance. The rest of the class gasped at the statement, and she looked up to see Adrian grinning at her all too happily. There was a sharp cry of protest, and they turned their attention to Chloe, whose mouth was wide open in disbelief. What do you mean, girlfriend? She screeched. Cheers and whistles erupted from the back of the class, and Chloe just stamped her feet childishly. Then she gasped and pointed accusingly at Marinette. Don't tell me. The picnic, you sneaky little... Adrian ignored her and escorted a blushing Marinette back to her seat and proceeded to sit down himself. Chloe went over to his side and slammed her hands on his desk. Adrian, tell me this isn't true, that she's blackmailing you or something. She glared at him with wide, desperate eyes. She just looked so absolutely ridiculous that he couldn't help but chuckle. She recoiled and gasped, and the classroom fell into silence. You laughed, she pointed out, and then directed her glare at Marinette, pointing a finger at her accusingly. What did you do to him? That's enough of your histrionics, Chloe, Adrian grinned. Class is about to start, he said, and pointed to the door where Miss Bustier just entered. Chloe frowned and marched back to her seat. A few more giggles echoed through the classroom, and Adrian felt more full of himself than he should have. All the guys in the school adored Marinette, but he was the one that managed to grab her attention. He couldn't wipe the stupid grin off of his face, and he was sure that even Miss Bustier was getting a little weirded out by it. By lunchtime, Alia had already grabbed Nino and went out the door, dashing any plans of the two girls having lunch together. Marinette frowned. She expected Alia to pull her away to explain things fully, but it seemed that she was satisfied with her own version of what happened. Rose and Julika walked by and congratulated her, Rose giving her a big hug. Ivan and Malen came down next, and Ivan patted her gently on the head. After that, the trio of Kim, Alex, and Max walked by, whistling and hooting at her. She blushed from all of the attention. Lastly, Nathaniel came down and gave her a shy smile. She felt her heart twinge, knowing well that he liked her. I'm happy for you, Marinette, he said. She nodded and thanked him quietly, feeling badly about crushing the poor boy's heart. He then turned his attention to Adrian and held his fist up for a pound. You're a lucky guy, Adrian, he said. Adrian grinned and bumped his fist against Nathaniel's. I know, he said, and Nathaniel exited the room. Chloe and Sabrina were the last two to leave, the former shooting daggers at Marinette on her way out. Well, that was strange. They were all acting as if I'd just gotten married or something. I hope Alia didn't say anything weird, Marinette mumbled. She pulled out her phone and texted Alia about it. Well, it only means good things for me. Adrian turned in his seat and smiled. I don't have to worry about anyone snatching you away. Aren't you a possessive one? She quirked a brow. Didn't you know? Cats are very territorial. Oh, I was unaware that you were a real cat, she giggled and stood up. Wanna come over for lunch? She asked him and his eyes lit up. He nodded vigorously and it made her laugh. He quickly texted Natalie that he was having lunch with a friend and not to have lunch prepared. If he got a scolding text in reply, he didn't care. When they left school, Adrian quickly went over to Gorilla to tell him that he was going to have lunch at the bakery across the street. The large man just peered at Marinette, and she shrunk back in nervousness. The bodyguard noticed how happy Adrian was with the girl and nodded silently in approval. "Thanks," Adrian grinned. "I'll bring you back a box of macaroons," he said, knowing that the man secretly had a sweet tooth. The teens made their way to the bakery, and Marinette commented on how surprisingly nice the gorilla was. Adrian laughed and agreed. He was sure that all of those times that he managed to escape, it was because the bodyguard had felt bad for the boy and let him. The bell by the entrance of the bakery chimed as they entered, and Sabine looked more than happy to see Adrian. "Hello, Madam Cheng," Adrian greeted Sabine politely, and she looked positively giddy. "Adrian, how good to see you," she smiled widely. Tom heard her from the back of the shop and poked his head out. A big grin appeared on his flour-covered face. "Welcome, son," he let out a hearty laugh. "Hello, Mr. Dupain," he replied with just as much vigor, and Marinette couldn't help but roll her eyes at the ridiculous scene. "Mom, I invited him for lunch. Is that okay?" Marinette asked her mother. "Of course it is." She was overly enthusiastic. Come, come. She ushered them towards the back so that they could go upstairs. "I'll bring you up some of that quiche that you like so much, dear." Marinette felt a little annoyed, finding it odd how quickly her family took to the boy, even though they've only met him a few times. Sure, he was charming, but sometimes she felt like they were practically handing her over on a silver platter. Knowing her parents, they were probably thinking something along the lines of, "Holy crap, he's such a good boy, we have to ship this or else she might end up with someone no good." She guessed she couldn't blame them, he pretty much was the total package. "Well, aren't you glad that my parents totally adore you?" Marinette placed her bag down on the sofa before heading over to the kitchen to grab some plates and utensils. He followed her and she gestured over to the stools by the table for him to sit. She filled 2 glasses with iced tea and moved to the table to sit with him. "What's not to love?" he asked. He still had an obnoxious grin on his face, ever since she blurted out that she had a crush on him. She figured it was okay though, the boy definitely needed an ego boost. "You're right, I'm sure they think you make great husband material," she added, only to see his face brighten up even more. She laughed at his elation. "Oh, what's this I hear about husband?" Sabine came flurrying in with a quiche in one hand and a plate of cupcakes in the other. Marinette flushed, not realizing that her mom had entered. "Mom," Marinette whined, and the woman just laughed. Sabine stepped between the 2 teens and placed the dishes down on the table. They both thanked her and she nodded. That was when she caught sight of something sparkling in the corner of her eyes. She looked down at Marinette's hand and quickly pulled her daughter's hand closer to her face. "Is this?" She started, eyes shifting over to look at Adrian's blushing face. She released the hand and brought her own up to her cheeks. "Oh, you too!" She giggled joyfully before pattering off to go back down to the bakery. "So cute," they heard before she disappeared completely. "See what I mean?" Marinette sighed, blush still evident on her face. She glanced over to him to see that his egomaniacal grin was gone and was replaced with a shy smile. "Yeah, your parents are something else. I'm glad," he chuckled, looking down at his perfectly frosted cupcakes. She frowned when she saw a brief flicker of loneliness pass through his features. She knew that he didn't have the best relationship with his father and that his mother wasn't in the picture. It must hurt to see how close her family was. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Well, they'll be your parents too someday," she smiled. Adrian's eyes grew misty and he blinked rapidly to banish any trace of tears. "We should eat," she said, making no motion to point out his brief moment of weakness. Marinette cut the quiche, placing a slice on his plate before her own. They talked about summer plans and briefly discussed the end-of-year exams. Adrian was top of the class, and Marinette was a fairly good student if you didn't take her attendance into account, so neither were worried about moving on to their next school. Adrian only hoped that his father would let him continue his public schooling. "Don't worry, if you end up being homeschooled again, I'll make sure to bust you out every day to hang out with us," Marinette grinned. Adrian laughed, mentioning that he was fully capable of escaping himself. After they finished the quiche, they eyed the cupcakes on the plate. "Natalie will kill me if she finds out what I'm having for lunch," he laughed. He had a strictly planned diet at home, and his meals often left much to be desired. The cupcakes were going to be a welcome treat. He was sure that he got enough exercise as Cat Nora to burn off the extra calories. "I'm pretty sure these are our yellow cupcakes," she pointed out. "We frost them differently depending on the kind of cake." "Do you help out at the bakery often?" He hummed in interest, wondering if she frosted any of the cupcakes on display downstairs. "Just a bit during our normal days. It gets hectic during holidays, so I'm usually busy during those times." "Chocolate or vanilla?" she asked, letting him decide whether he wanted the one with chocolate frosting or vanilla. He seemed to ponder for a bit before picking the vanilla one. Marinette giggled. "What?" he asked, wondering if there was something funny about his choice. "I always saw you as a chocolate kind of guy," she smiled. "Oh, I am, but I've recently found a new love for vanilla." His eyes crinkled in amusement as he took a bite out of his cupcake. He licked his lips suggestively and winked at her, making her blush furiously. He grinned, finding her reaction completely endearing. She pursed her lips and pouted. You really are unbelievable.